My name is Carl, and tonight I'm going to be speaking on behalf of my group about climate change adaptation and creating a framework for the city of Philadelphia. First, I'm going to discuss what adaptation planning framework actually means and why it's important that Philadelphia has one. I'll go through the research process that we went through, which was a benchmarking process. I'll briefly touch on some of our recommendations and key findings, go through challenges that we encountered along the way, and wrap up with our next steps. So our client is the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in Philadelphia. And the initial question that they posed to us was, what should our city do to get ready for climate change? And this was a little bit beyond the scope of what our group could offer in one semester and with the number of people that we had. But we were able to take the best practices that we found and form a framework that Philadelphia could use to start approaching this question themselves. So why are we looking at this issue? Why is it important? Philadelphia already has a good mitigation plan. It has a citywide report called GreenWorks that sets really good goals for emissions reductions and energy use. But the fact is that climate change is already here. And so in addition to cutting back, Philadelphia really does need to plan for the future. And it's a new type of problem. With mitigation, for instance, it's pretty easy for individual departments to meet goals, to reduce emissions, to meet energy goals, but climate change doesn't respect jurisdictional boundaries or geographic boundaries. This is a problem that requires an interconnected and collaborative approach. And it's going to require that a lot of flexibility is built into the planning process. So what you see here are 4 components that form a comprehensive plan. And there's multiple components within each one, but essentially on the top left, first the city needs to understand what the climate models say. And once they've figured that out, they need to assess what their risks are and what are priorities. After that, they need to figure out how they're actually going to implement these plans that they make, form strategies, and then they need to be able to monitor their results so that they can, A, change strategies based on what's working well or what's not, and B, address new climate change data that becomes available. So we built our framework using a benchmarking process. We looked at what leading practitioners in the field were saying, both in literature reviews and by reaching out to them on the phone. And based on our research, we developed recommendations in each of those areas that I pointed out, and I'll go into a little more depth now. So Philadelphia can't plan for climate change without trying first to understand what it actually means for the city, what is going to change. And so we wanted to know, what have people who are at the forefront of this field done to find that information out? And there are many methods of taking global climate models and trying to downscale them and consolidate them to a regional level. And there's multiple schools of thought whether or not that's actually necessary, whether or not you need regional projections. But regardless, the successful cities that we looked at all involved climate scientists early and kept them involved throughout the entire planning process. Philadelphia needs to go into this knowing that climate models are uncertain and that they're going to be operating with that baseline uncertainty at all times. But the good news is that there's data available now and that they can get started with it. Once the city has the information that they're looking for, they need to prioritize risk, and this is all about the likelihood, the magnitude, and the timing of climate change events. So how do you pay for all this? Bringing an adaptation strategy to reality can involve big capital projects, but before you even get to that stage, how do you fund the data acquisition? And how do you support the scientists that you need to work on it? Our first finding is that money comes from a lot of different places. It can be from the government, from NGOs, from public-private partnerships. Some people have found that the funding solution that they need is to break an adaptation plan into multiple components and fund each chunk along the way. Or going on an adaptation plan with cities or towns within your region to split the cost. or try to shift the costs of adaptation planning to the private sector by building in your adaptation goals to new zoning requirements or building design standards. But most important, it's critical to make a link between adaptation and mitigation goals, because if you can manage to get funding for one, you can use that funding to carry over into the other. Now, I mentioned that adaptation planning requires an interconnected framework in order to succeed. The city needs an organizational structure that can support this, and that means getting city departments to work together. It's really crucial to have a strong champion of adaptation. This is going to be Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia, hopefully, if we're convincing enough. And it needs a coordinating body, but equally as importantly, you need to get the individual departments that are involved early, so that they can each start considering what's going to be required of them as part of an adaptation plan. And it's also really important to, as we mentioned, bring in the scientific community and possible consultants in early as well. So the question is, how do you do this? And the answer that we found is by communicating. And we learned that there are many different thoughts about climate change out there. But regardless of how you talk about it, it's important to get people to understand that climate change is a local issue and that the effects will be tangible. One adaptation planner we spoke to actually said, there's nothing like a flood map to get people engaged. But this is a really important point, because adaptation plans, if they don't have the engagement of both the government and the public, are less likely to succeed. One challenge in adaptation planning is that it can feel like just one more responsibility or added procedural requirement for the city agencies involved. And our findings showed that the earlier that these agencies were brought into the process, the easier it is to mainstream or kind of weave adaptation planning into their daily operations and capital planning. Processes should really be created up front, but should remain flexible for the two reasons I mentioned. Climate data is ever evolving, and second, because the city's adaptation plan should change in response to how well it's doing. And the city can't judge how well the adaptation plan is doing unless it has a system of measurement or metrics. Monitoring performance allows a feedback loop to continually update an adaptation plan so that it is most effective. And the best adaptation plans that we looked at clearly stated the metrics that they're looking at and would continually reassess. The good news is that Philadelphia really isn't starting from scratch here. Their mitigation plan, as you can see, lays out a lot of initiatives that do overlap with what's considered adaptation. So this is important both from a funding perspective, as I mentioned, but also it's a morale boost for the city. This is something that they're already getting started on. They have the tools to do many of these things. What we're doing is simply organizing a framework for them to comprehensively plan. Along the way, we did run up against a few issues. We had a very wide scope. Sometimes our best practices weren't in total agreement, and occasionally the jury was out on whether or not an adaptation strategy was actually effective. But by spending time interviewing the leaders of this field and with the data, we were able to put forth what we considered to be our best recommendations and the pros and cons that were associated with each one. So we've already circulated an outline of our report along with a list of all the experts that we spoke to in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And this Friday, we're going to go there and present our final findings and submit a report, not only to the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but also to representatives from agencies across the entire city of Philadelphia. So we're really excited about that.